Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is video number 3, probably the final video that I will do in my review and response to James White's video in which he reviewed the Frost versus Preston 3-day radio debate. His review was actually fairly short. He didn't cover tons of material. He certainly didn't try to make any exegetical, biblical arguments per se. He made a comment or two that I'm going to notice this morning. And he didn't try to substantiate anything with either, number one, a logical argument, or number two, as just stated, certainly not with any exegetical development of any text. His statements were really just bold assertions. And I'm sorry, and Mr. White knows this, as an experienced debater, James White knows that making an assertion proves not one thing. And thus, he seemed to be rather perplexed by the fact that in my debate with Sam Frost, I appealed to Hosea 13, as well as Isaiah 24 to 27. And listen, Mr. White is an amillennialist. I was raised as a fifth-generation member of the amillennial world. So I fully understand where Mr. White is coming from in his comments. I also realize how incredibly false the presupposition is. You see, in the amillennial world in which I was raised, now I was not raised in the Reformed view of amillennialism, and there are some nuances between the view in which I was raised and the Reformed view, to be sure. But the broad outline of the eschatology is still the same. And by the way, I'm really curious to know, as a Reformed amillennialist, whether Mr. White accepts the Westminster Confession of Faith in regard to its eschatology, particularly its view of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the man of sin. You see, I was raised believing that the man of sin was the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. And makes me curious to know whether or not Mr. White follows the creed, the Westminster Confession of Faith. But I digress a little bit on that, but it is an important issue here. Now, fundamental to the amillennial world is the basic assumption that God was through with the Old Testament. Jesus nailed the law of Moses to the cross. And an appeal is made to Colossians 2:14 to 17 on this. Well, I'm not going to go into full detail on this. By the way, let me suggest you go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and you read the 2 articles that I have there on the present active tenses and the present passive tenses of the Greek in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And just think very, very seriously, because one of the passages that I adduce, that I discuss, is Colossians 2:14 to 17. It does not teach the law, that the law of Moses was nailed to the cross. Nonetheless, fundamental to the amillennial view is that God was through with Israel at the cross. Beginning at Pentecost, God essentially started all over again with the church. And with the church and with the new covenant, there was a brand new set of promises given. The eschatology of the church is not the eschatology of Old Covenant Israel, which means, by the way, that the amillennial world essentially agrees with those in Romans chapter 11 who were saying that God was already through with Israel, and Paul said, God forbid. That's just simply not true. Now, that was true when Paul said it, not true now. I don't have time to develop that. So here we have Mr. White arguing from a presuppositional position that said God was through with Israel, Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. God was through with the law of Moses at the cross, and that necessarily means, guess what? Hosea 13, Isaiah 24 to 27 is not the context of Paul's discussion of resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Now that's what he said. Hosea 13 is not the context of 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, well, you just absolutely got to catch the power of this. Now look, again, when I was an amillennialist, I would have agreed fully with that. Let me tell you a very quick anecdote. This may stretch the video out just a little bit. But some years ago, I was in a formal public debate in Marlow, Oklahoma, with a man. He's a friend of mine now. His name is Bill Lockwood. Prior to the actual beginning of the debate, I asked Brother Lockwood, are your eschatological hopes based upon, taken from, the yet future fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? Mr. Lockwood, good faithful amillennialist that he was, wrote out beside the question in big, bold, capital letters, no, followed by 3 exclamation points, underlined 3 times, and in quotations. Reckon he was trying to convey something? Now, that in a nutshell, unless Mr. White wants to disagree with that, I would love to hear from him to know whether or not he would disagree with that. But as an amillennialist, that's the essential fundamental view. So I got up and I made the following observations, just like I did in my debate with Sam Frost. Paul said his doctrine of the resurrection, point number 1, was nothing but the hope of Israel. His hope of the resurrection was found in Moses, the law, and the prophets, Acts 24, 13 and following. His hope of the resurrection was the same hope of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, believe you me, they each had a nuance to it. Paul knew what he was expecting. He knew what the Old Testament prophets actually foretold. Unfortunately, that hope had been distorted and perverted. I'll have more to say about that at a later time. Nonetheless, the essential hope was there, resurrection. And Paul said, our 12 tribes hope to attain to that. In Acts 26, 21 and following, Paul said, and now having obtained help from God, I stand before both before small and great, testifying, listen to this, no other things than what Moses and the prophets said should come to pass, that Christ would be the first to be raised from the dead, and that he should preach life and light to the Gentiles. Do you catch the power of that? Paul's doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and thus the resurrection of believers. He said, I don't preach anything else. Nothing else. I had asked Sam Frost prior to our debate, in 1 Corinthians 15, was Paul anticipating the fulfillment of Hosea chapter 13? Is the resurrection of Hosea 13, or of 1 Corinthians 15, the same resurrection of Hosea chapter 13? He answered, yes, it was. Now, you know what that means? That means that Hosea 13 was the context for Paul's discussion of resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. How can Paul be looking for the fulfillment of Hosea chapter 13 and Hosea 13 not be the context of 1 Corinthians 15? Now, here's what I pointed out in the debate, interestingly enough, which Mr. White said not a word about. The resurrection of Hosea chapter, let me start all over. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be in fulfillment of Hosea chapter 13, overcoming the death of Hosea 13. The death that would be overcome in the resurrection foretold by Hosea 13, 14 is the death defined in Hosea 13, 1 and 2. When Israel humbled himself before God, he was exalted. But when he sinned in Baal, he died. And yet he sinned more and more. Now look, he's obviously speaking of a corporate sense. when Ephraim, when Israel, those are collective terms, he died. Well, he didn't die physically. How do dead men keep on sinning? And thus Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, anticipating the fulfillment of Hosea 13, the overcoming of the death of Hosea chapter 13, was looking for the corporate resurrection of Israel. Not a nationalistic, not a geopolitical, not a militaristic restoration, but her spiritual resurrection and her spiritual transformation into the body of Christ. Now, in the debate with Frost, I spent at least 3 presentations showing that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 would be in fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8. The resurrection of Isaiah 25 and verse 8 is the resurrection of Isaiah 26, 10 and following. The resurrection of Isaiah 25 and 26 would be fulfilled according to Isaiah 27 when Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple destroyed, and the people whom God had created would no longer receive mercy. I pointed out Isaiah 25, 1 to 3. That resurrection of Isaiah 25, verse 8, once again, would be fulfilled when the city and the temple was turned over to foreigners. Mr. Frost said not one word in response to that exegetical presentation given 3 times. Now watch this. Paul was anticipating the fulfillment of Isaiah 25. But that means that Isaiah 25 is the context for 1 Corinthians 15. And since Isaiah 25 through 27, technically 24 through 29, posits that resurrection at the time of the destruction of Old Covenant Israel, the corporate body, but the resurrection of the righteous remnant and her transformation into the body of Christ, that means that 1 Corinthians 15 is about the spiritual resurrection of the corporate body of the righteous remnant and her transformation from the corruption of the Old Covenant world to the incorruption of the New Covenant world. Funny that Mr. White did not say literally not one word about my 3 different presentations on Isaiah 25 to 27. Instead, choosing simply to ignore it and to claim, oh, Hosea is not the context for 1 Corinthians 15. Well, folks, let me reiterate and let me close with this. Point number 1 again. Paul said his doctrine of the resurrection was nothing but what Moses, the law, and the prophets said should come to pass. That was the hope of Israel. Secondly, Paul's doctrine of the resurrection was based squarely upon Hosea. Thus, Hosea was the context of 1 Corinthians 15. The resurrection hope of 1 Corinthians 15 was the resurrection hope of Isaiah 25 to 27. That means that Isaiah 25 to 27 is the context for 1 Corinthians 15. Oh, by the way, we could add Ezekiel 37 lies behind 1 Corinthians 15, as most scholars believe. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is the source of Paul's resurrection doctrine in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Most scholars agree. You know what that means? That means that Ezekiel 37 is the context of 1 Corinthians 15. It means that Daniel chapter 12 is the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And thus, while on the one hand I find it remarkable and truly sad that Mr. James White has such an insecure, uninformed, unbiblical view of resurrection and eschatology to cause him to say Hosea and Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel are not the context of 1 Corinthians 15? And at the same time, I fully understand where he's coming from. I just know it is a false paradigm. Now listen, I've developed all of this extensively in my book, The Death of Adam, The Life of Christ. That's what 1 Corinthians 15 is all about, right? Hey, is the death of Adam of Genesis the context of 1 Corinthians 15? Oh, that means the Old Testament is the context of 1 Corinthians 15. Well, anyway, okay, go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Go to the store, find the book, The Death of Adam, The Life of Christ. Order the book, send me a note saying you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping, saving you almost $5. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. I believe this is more than sufficient for our discussion, our review, and response to Mr. White's video. Hope you've enjoyed it. You have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you on Monday.